Zodiac, a symbol that now stands for terror in San Francisco.
He was the most wanted man in America.
The Unabomber. To the 18-year reign of terror caused by the Unabomber.
A long anti-technology manifesto from the Unabomber entitled Industrial Society and Its Future.
He is not under arrest.
He's that important.
I'm Yani.
And this is Lagit.
And today we're going to delve into the minds of criminals. And we're discussing two stories about history's most infamous cases of serial killers. So stick with us to find out more. But first, let's try and understand these criminals.
Hold on, why should we try to understand criminals? Aren't they just psychopaths?
Well, you're not wrong. But maybe there's more to them than just insanity.
Alright, that's very true. Personally, I believe that it may have been wired in their genes to be serial killers. Actually, have you heard about this thing called the biological markers of psychopaths? Some even say that there are genes that contribute to a higher tendency for violence.
Oh yeah, right. I've heard of that before. Apparently some people are more rage-prone naturally, but what exactly constitutes criminal behavior? How does the law and society set benchmarks for unacceptable behavior? As we know, criminal behavior like killing and robbing are seen to be anti-social behavior which is condemned by society. Let me give you an example of serial killers. Now, what makes these serial killers scary is not that they have the ability to kill people. Truthfully, we all have the ability to do so, but we choose not to do it. And why do we not do it? Because we have the social conditioning and most importantly the empathy we have within us. It is just within our human nature not to hurt anyone. So by this line of argument, can it be argued that these serial killers have an absence of that?
In our third-person view, their actions may be ridiculous or downright evil. But what if we try to step into their shoes? Maybe we could find things that could instill some kind of empathy within us.
Let's take a look at our agenda today. Firstly, we are going to discuss the 4 common types of serial killers we see portrayed in reality. Then we are going to talk about 2 exciting and thrilling stories on serial killers. We'll look into their MO, which is also known as the modus operandi of killers, referring to their style of operation. Next, we will debate on whether psychopaths are born or made. We'll put ourselves in the shoes of victims to understand their ordeal. And finally, we'll learn more about criminal profiling, which is a novel method of investigation police use to understand criminal minds.
Okay, let's quickly run through the 4 types of serial killers. Firstly, we have our thrill seekers. As the name suggests, they are killers who kill for fun. Most of the time, they are sociopaths that see outsmarting the law as a form of amusement. For example, these killers would purposely send messages and codes to the police to taunt them and glee when the police cannot find them. These are killers who enjoy being pursued by the police and getting attention from the media. Secondly, we have our mission-oriented killers. These are killers who feel like they're doing society a favor by ridding of certain people they feel like society can do without. Interestingly, these killers are generally not psychotic, contrary to popular belief. Also, these killers are easy to track down because they always go after certain victims and have a controlled crime scene. Thirdly, we have our visionary serial killers. These are people who occasionally suffer psychotic breaks from society and even believe that they are another person, compelled to murder by entities like the god or the devil. And lastly, we have our power and control killers. These serial killers are probably the most represented type in the media. They enjoy the victim's terror, suffering, and screaming. These killers tend to be very organized and they usually have a history of childhood abuse, which left them feeling powerless and inadequate as adults. Keep all these in mind as we go through the 2 stories. First up, we have the story of the Zodiac Killer. The day is December 20th, 1968. Around 10:15 p.m., 17-year-old David Durradi and 16-year-old Betty Lou parked at a gravel turnout in a popular lovers lane in North California. Sadly, they never made it home after their date. They were found shot to death at 11 p.m. Thus began the reign of terror by the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most notorious killers of all time. He had a very specific MO, which stands for Modus Operandi, using codes to confuse the police. He also has a tendency to present himself to the media. Despite the brazen crimes and clues to the authorities, the Zodiac Killer was never caught and run free to this day. A number of suspects have been named by investigators, but until now, there is no definitive clue as to who the Zodiac Killer was.
Notorious. Nearly 7 months after the murders in Benicia, the Zodiac Killer struck again. On July 4, 1969, another young man and woman, Michael Mageau and Darlene Farron, were shot in Vallejo, California around midnight as they sat in a car parked at a golf course. The killer actually called the police from a payphone at about 12:40 a.m. and reported the double murder, also mentioning that he had killed the kids last year, in reference to the Benicia slayings. Mageau survived the attack but wasn't able to provide a description to the police. On July 31, 1969, the Zodiac Killer sent letters to 3 local newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each of these letters contained a confession of the 2 murders and 1/3 of a cipher. When assembled and cracked, the cipher discussed how much the Zodiac Killer liked killing. On September 27, 1969, came the 3rd attack. One evening, 2 college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing by the shore of Lake Berryessa, about 25 miles from Napa, California, when they were approached by a man wearing a homemade executioner's mask. He claimed to be an escaped prison convict who was trying to get to Mexico. He needed the students' money and car. He tied them up and then, without warning, pulled out a knife and stabbed them. Then, he used a marker to vandalize Brian's car, memorializing his killing before making his escape. Again, the killer called the police from a payphone to alert them about the attack. Meanwhile, Good Samaritans had found the victims and they were rushed to the hospital. Miraculously, Hartnell survived his stabbing. A 4th attack happened on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights area of San Francisco. The Zodiac Killer shot a cab driver, Paul Stein, and then cut off and stole a part of the cabbie's bloody shirt. From then on, the killer sent taunting letters to the press and the police, referring to himself as the Zodiac and discussing the mystical and intellectual basis of his motivation for the killings. He also provided unknown details of his crimes, made threats, and offered puzzles and coded clues to future murder plots. Twice, he even included pieces of Stein's bloody shirt with his letters as proof. The 4th attack was the final one. For the next 5 years, the Zodiac Killer continued to send letters to the media and authorities until 1974. Though he may have sent correspondence until 1978, no one can be sure if all the messages received really came from the killer. Over time, the authorities have interviewed nearly 2,500 people regarding the crimes. Due to the killer's communication with newspapers, which somewhat sensationally printed his letters, the public was highly interested in the Zodiac Killer. Even today, tips still pour in and people have confessed to being the Zodiac Killer and made accusations to authorities that various family members or colleagues were the Zodiac Killer. Internet groups pore over every detail of the crimes in an attempt to crack the killer's identity. So far, only one of the 4 pictograms sent by the killer has ever been decoded. One of the 3 unsolved puzzles allegedly provides the name of the Zodiac Killer.
One unique feature about his letters is that each letter is enclosed with a symbol consisting of a circle with a cross through it, in what would have come to be known as the Zodiac Killer's symbol. A high school teacher linked to one of the Zodiac's attacks were able to solve the cipher. It read, "I like killing people because it's so much fun. It is so much fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." Some psychologists believe that he was a narcissistic and paranoid social misfit and loner who was mainly driven by the need for attention, power, and most of all, credibility. He felt the urge to prove his intellectual superiority in order to compensate his own feelings of inferiority. So, what type of serial killer do you think he is? Vote on your top right-hand corner. Now, Ligit will bring you through our second story, the Unabomber.
This second story I'm going to share is about this highly intelligent and a very strange terrorist called the Unabomber. Between 1978 and 1995, the Unabomber killed 3 people and injured another 23 others in his course to start a revolution by conducting a nationwide bombing campaign targeting people involved with modern technology. He mailed handmade bombs crafted and made of wooden parts to university professors, academics, and airline officers, and injuries ranged from minor cuts and burns to severe damage in the eardrums, hearing loss, vision loss in one eye, and having their hand blown off. The Unabomber publicly admitted to the New York Times that he blew up his second victim because the victim's organization helped to cover up the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. By the way, the Exxon Valdez oil spill was one of the most environmentally damaging oil spills worldwide, where 21,000 US gallons of oil still remains on beaches in Prince William Sound, up to 725 km away, even after 25 years since its spill. This triggered something very strong and deep inside Kaczynski, and he then murdered the president of the Californian Forestry Association, a timber lobbying group, through a mail bomb in 1995. Exactly who is the Unabomber? He is known as Ted Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor and prodigy from Harvard with a high IQ, and he abandoned his academic career to lead a more simplistic, primitive lifestyle free from modern technology and industrialization. He moved to an isolated cabin in the woods without electricity or running water, and a trigger point came when he realized one day the extent of destruction of the wilderness around his cabin. This anger fueled his later actions, as he felt that his bombings were extreme but necessary to attract attention to the erosion of human freedom and dignity by modern technologies that require large-scale organization. Eventually, Kaczynski was caught after the longest and most expensive investigation by the FBI when his 35,000-word essay under the pseudonym of FC, or Freedom Club, was published in the newspapers as per his request, and his brother tipped the police off as he recognized Ted's writing style in the manifesto. His manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, discusses his belief that technology has had a destabilizing effect on society, has made life unfulfilling, and has caused widespread psychological suffering. The pseudonym FC can be seen as a signature mark of his that could be found carved in every of his wooden bombs. Let's now watch a video of his eventual arrest.
Well, it was a week in 1996 that Montana was thrust into the national spotlight for being the hideout location for the infamous mail bomb terrorist that became known as the Unabomber. MTN reporters from around the state were working closely with the National Press Corps as we tried to keep up with the fast-breaking story.
It was a story that brought the nation's attention to this small, unassuming cabin in a remote area of Montana. The Treasure State didn't ask for it, but suddenly all eyes were on Lincoln, Montana. After a 17-year search for the elusive terrorist that became known as the Unabomber, short for University and Airline Bomber, FBI agents finally closed in on their reclusive prey, Ted Kaczynski. The press coverage of Kaczynski's capture was amplified by the fact that the national media was already in the state. 320 miles away, the feds had an anti-government group holed up on a ranch near Jordan in what eventually became the 81-day Freeman standoff. But as soon as news broke that the FBI had closed in on the man they thought responsible for years of mail bomb attacks meant to further his anti-technology ideology, they pulled stake in Jordan and flocked to Lincoln. Those that knew him were caught off guard that this quiet, mild-mannered man was responsible for killing 3 people and injuring 24 more.
There's other people I would have thought were, if they're going to pick somebody in Lincoln, Montana, I'd have thought not him. He's just too quiet and unassuming.
The events in Lincoln stunned people across the state and the nation, but University of Great Falls professor Ron Haverland says it makes perfect sense.
It all fits in place, of course. He's anti-technological, he's anti-domination. He links the two together, the inhumaneness of technology And where else would he go but to Lincoln, which is at the southern end of the continent's largest wilderness area?
Kaczynski pleaded guilty to his crimes nearly 2 years later in Sacramento. The entire cabin that served as home base for his deadly schemes, in fact, was packed up and shipped to California to serve as evidence in the trial. In Billings, Janelle Slade, MTN News.
I remember it like it was yesterday. Ted Kaczynski currently serving a life sentence. His cabin that once stood in Lincoln, well, the whole thing is on display at the Newseum, which is a museum dedicated to the news, and that's in the nation's capital.
Until now, Kaczynski remains strangely very well connected with the outside world through sharing letters and stories, and prides himself on his belief, as he proudly wrote prisoner as his occupation and listed his 8 counts of life sentences under his achievements in his Harvard reunion query.
Clearly, Kaczynski wanted to gain attention from the public. Some may think he's a narcissist, but others may think that he was a mission-oriented killer and really wanted to change society for the better.
Yeah, same. I can't decide whether they should ever deserve a second chance. But if you look closely, aren't the Zodiac Killer and the Unabomber similar in some ways?
Right! I think the most disturbing thing is that both of them are actually more intelligent than the average person. Kaczynski even had a crazy high IQ of 167. That's very impressive considering that a score above 160 is considered genius.
Right, and that puts him on the same level as Albert Einstein. The Zodiac Killer is also pretty smart considering that after all these years, even with advanced technology like DNA tracing, he still manages to get away from the law and was so confident that he won't get caught, he would taunt the police and in the newspapers. And you can clearly tell that they're narcissists because they enjoy doing these kind of things.
Yeah, also you can tell that both of them show a huge lack of empathy, which is very common in psychopaths and sociopaths. When Kaczynski was a toddler, he was sent to hospital for severe hives, such that he was isolated from the family members for months. That's when he became emotionally distant, although he showed some sympathy towards helpless animals in cages. Maybe that's when his obsession to protect wildlife against technology and destruction of nature began.
Alright, his childhood experience does really explain his behavior later on. But what about the Zodiac Killer? We still don't know who the Zodiac Killer is, but based on his way of murdering his victims, what do you guys think might have happened in his childhood? Share your theories in the comment section below.
Here's the technicalities of what exactly constitutes a crime scene and a murderer. The concept of classifying serial homicide crime scenes according to an organized or disorganized dichotomy was based on a study of 36 serial predators conducted by FBI agents. For organized killers, their murders are premeditated and planned very carefully, so little evidence can be found at the scene. They are usually antisocial but know right from wrong, are not insane, and show no remorse, but on the surface they appear controlled and even charming and attractive, as they have above average intelligence. On the other hand, these organized crimes are not planned, and criminals typically leave evidence such as fingerprints or blood at the scene of the murder, and there's often no attempt to move or otherwise conceal the corpse after the murder. These disorganized killers are likely to come from an unstable or dysfunctional family where they have been abused physically or sexually by relatives and are often isolated from others. They often do not have reliable transportation, so they kill their victims closer to home than organized offenders. Unlike organized killers who plan their murders carefully, they often use sudden and overwhelming force to assault them, which can be seen in a prime example of the serial killer Jack the Ripper. Other behavioral characteristics include their modus operandi and their signature. Then you may ask, aren't they both the same thing?
So, a killer's modus operandi, or MO, refers to their mode of operation, which are the things that they have to do to commit the crime. For example, having a way to restrain the victim, like tying them to a chair with a rope. So the MO is a learned behavior that is subjected to change, meaning that the killer can refine and even change the way they execute the murder over time. So every crime must have an MO, but not all killers have a unique signature, because the unique signature only serves the emotional or psychological need, such as branding their own symbol on the victims' bodies or mutilating the bodies in a certain unique style.
Okay, but don't start panicking, guys, because apparently there's a way to spot a psychopath before you land yourself in danger. Do note that all criminals are psychopaths, but not all psychopaths are criminals. The actual behavior of psychopaths are not easily defined, but most psychologists view it as a personality disorder characterized by superficial charm, together with profound dishonesty, insensitivity, cruel disregard for others, guiltlessness, and poor impulse control. And before you start thinking that your strange, quiet neighbor may secretly be a cold-blooded murderer, know that psychopaths only make up 1% of the general public. So calm down and you won't be that unlucky. I hope lah. You know how Sherlock Holmes said,
I'm not a psychopath, Anderson. I'm a high-functioning sociopath. Do your research.
Well, actually, a neuroscientist have said that Sherlock Holmes is actually more of a primary psychopath. Most of us get confused between the terms psychopath and sociopath, so let's learn what's the difference between them. Both lack empathy, but a psychopath completely doesn't show or feel remorse because they don't have a conscience, but they might observe others and pretend to act in the way that they do to prevent being caught. On the other hand, a sociopath does feel a slight tinge of guilt, although it's so weak, it can't stop their bad behavior anyway. One way to remember the difference is the phrase cold-hearted psychopaths and hot-headed sociopaths. Psychopaths are intelligent, charming, and very manipulative, such that they seem to be leading normal lives, while sociopaths can be clearly seen as more violent, rage-prone, and basically something's wrong with them lah. So, are psychopaths born or bred? Can you be born a psychopath? Studies have suggested that there's a strong genetic component in the making of a psychopath, and actually some of these traits are selected in evolution because they bring about benefits, especially when your profession requires you to keep a cool head and not let your emotion cloud your judgment. Like that heartless looking cool CEO you see in Korean movies. Here's a clear difference in the brain structure of a normal person and a psychotic person. As you can see here, the brain of a psychopath at the bottom shows reduced activities in the region responsible for your emotions and empathy. The truth is, science doesn't care about how altruistic or how many good deeds you do, but it's all about the necessary traits that firstly keep you alive in this competitive world by reading competition that threaten your survival. Of course, in this modern world, these tendencies in nature aren't bad, but if you take it to the extreme and crazy cruel behaviors like murder manifest from it, then that's just plain barbaric and you can't just blame genetics for your actions. Anyway, don't just blame your genes, because to be really insane, you need both the DNA and the upbringing to dictate the way you behave. Negative behavior can be learned from childhood, when neglected children learn to act in a certain way and manipulate others to gain attention from their parents, so their personality can change and develop over time based on their traumatic experiences. This can be seen in many serial killers who often had traumatic childhood experiences that caused them to maybe target a certain group of people, like women, if they were abused by their mother. Anyway, please just run as far as you can when you spot a psychopath, because while they might not ever be killers in this lifetime, they are still equally damaging to your mental well-being. Most people run, but there are some people who don't fear their captors, but instead they develop a positive response to them. Yanni, do you know what is this strange phenomenon?
Yes, I do know, and this phenomenon is called the Stokholm syndrome. Now, let me explain. Most victims would fear their captors, and many even develop PTSD after surviving a traumatic experience. It is, after all, our human nature to develop psychological trauma. In fact, just to give you guys some statistics, about 46% of kidnapped victims develop PTSD and 38% develop major depression. However, things are slightly different for about 8% of kidnapped victims who have survived, according to the FBI. That's because they've developed Stockholm syndrome. They become increasingly fearful and depressed and will show a decreased ability to care for themselves. This, in turn, will make them more dependent on their captors for care. And naturally, when the captor shows any form of care, the victim feels a sense of gratitude towards them. This is because the victim already feels subjected under the captor, and the captor is treated like the only person who can help or harm them. That said, the captor can be viewed as a god in times of emergency. Let's watch this short video to find out more.
So, one part of Stockholm Syndrome might be adapting to your situation, and in fact, the girl we just talked about has denied being mentally ill and said in a way she just made the best out of a bad situation. She said this to the BBC: "If you spend a great deal of time with a person, it's about empathy, communication. Looking for normality within the framework of a crime is not a syndrome, it's a survival strategy. In the case of the hostages at the bank, their lives were in the hands of their captors, so psychologists say they developed powerful feelings for these guys. Those men were the ones who were going to let them live, and so they were kind of gods to them. And they did let them live, so hey, they were benevolent gods in the end. Anyone in captivity for a while might at some point show gratitude toward their captors for even the smallest acts of kindness. After a longer period of time, the captive person becomes reliant on the captor for everything, and so they might become like a child to that person." One psychologist wrote, "They experience a type of infantilization, where, like a child, they're unable to eat, speak, or go to the toilet without permission. There have been studies when the captive person was told that life without their captor is dangerous, and they believed it, to the extent of not trying to even run away when they had the chance." So first, a person might feel utter terror, but as a survival mechanism they might even begin to empathize with the person who has them locked up. It's a coping mechanism, and somewhere in the mind a switch might get flicked and the person might start liking their captor. It's the only way to get through it. They submit to their god, and when that god doesn't exhibit its wrath, this becomes an act of kindness. This submission, importantly.
Up to this point, we've covered how criminal minds work and how victims are affected. But how does understanding criminal actually apply to real life? In our final section today, we're going to cover how criminal psychology is used. So, the police study criminals because studying them is the only way of preventing crimes from happening. Criminal profiling is an investigation of crime based on crime scene analysis, forensic psychology, behavioral science, in hopes of understanding the criminal's work style and motivations for crime. This is often used for unknown criminals. Being a relatively new investigative method, profilers often disagree on their methodology and terminology in profiling, but one thing that they agree on is the use of evidence and statements to develop a description of an unknown offender. While this particular method can be used to characterize criminals, it is in no way a method to replace other criminal investigative methods. Rather, it is used as a complement to these investigative methods. Criminal profiling depends solely on the assumption that similar crimes will be committed by similar people. These fundamental assumptions offender profiling relies upon have actually been proven outdated by advances in psychology and behavioral science. In fact, some serial killers even have the tendency to change their method of killing to mislead the police. The majority of profiling approaches assume that behavior is primarily determined by personality and not situational factors, which is an assumption that psychological research has recognized as a mistake since the 1960s. At this point, I guess we can safely say that not all criminal investigative methods are perfect, and the criminal mind can be very unpredictable and difficult to comprehend for the majority of us. So, we hope that you guys have enjoyed our session this week and gained a better understanding about the criminal mind. Stay tuned for part 2 of the crime episode series next week, where Sarah and Xuanling will be exploring more on punishment and guilt. Thank you guys for listening today, and we hope to see you guys next time. Bye! Alright! Wait.
Right, I think...
So today we're going to... Oh, sorry.
Okay.